my fellow panelists here. We'll start with Bob. Bob is our representative here from Checkpoint Technologies, as you can see from his rather spiffing shirt. So, Bob, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Bob Cruz. I'm CEO and co-founder of Checkpoint Technologies. So we are headquartered in the Tampa Bay area of Florida. I have been in IT for 36 years now. Started off as a COBOL developer back in the day, back when it was pretty much all waterfall, and I transitioned into a love for quality assurance and software testing in the mid 1990s. So again, welcome. I hope everybody gets a lot out of this webinar. I'm sure you will. And I am so excited to be with Melissa, John, and of course you, Dermot. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Bob. So over to Melissa. Melissa joins us from Orca Intelligence. So Melissa, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So thank you for having me, Fletcher and Dermot. And I'm looking forward to speaking with Bob and John as well. So Orca Intelligence, I am the founder and CEO of Orca Intelligence. We're based out of Silver Spring, Maryland, and we do digital transformation for primarily public and nonprofit organizations. And we do commercial as well, or even quasi-government. And I will say that our claim to fame is that we have a tool called Swiftly that speeds up the digital transformation process by creating requirements using behavioral-driven approach. So that's something that we're really proud of on our side of Orca.
Okay, and then we have John Armenia joining us from AccuSoft. John, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, thanks. It's my pleasure, and I'm glad to be here with the rest of you. I'm the Vice President of Engineering and Technology at AccuSoft. I've been a software engineer for going on 24 years now. Originally started working in healthcare and came to digital imaging and processing back in 2014 to AccuSoft.
Okay, and then as for me, my name is Dermot Caniff. I've been with Inflectra for nearly a year now, and I'm involved in customer success and pre-sales engineering. So I'm just a guy standing in front of a prospect, asking them to like our product, or rather asking them to integrate our product into their own existing technical estate.
Well, hey, Dermot, I got to ask you, though, because I know that accent is not from Alabama. So
that's true.
So where are you moderating us from?
So yes, I'm a little bit further east than Alabama. I'm moderating from the west of Ireland. So I'm based in Galway. From the point of view of what we're discussing, we're going to be talking about behavior-driven development. The idea here is that we want to surface some of the facts around BDD. There's a certain mystique around it. There's even a certain amount of it's almost like a religious fervor sometimes when you're talking to some people. But from another point of view, it can be very pragmatic. It can solve a lot of problems. It can sometimes introduce some problems as well. So we want to just surface that through our discussions today here in front of you. And as I said, if you've any questions along the way, fire them into the question and answer panel. Be more than happy to hear what you have to say. On that subject, we'd love to find out from you if you're currently following a behavior-driven development-based workflow. So I've just popped open a poll. The answers to that are yes, no, partially, intend to, or what's BDD, because I don't want to make assumptions here. Okay. So yeah, if you can feed that back, we're just going to kick it off basically with that last answer there. What's BDD? So just going based on who I have in my window, I'm going to start with you, Melissa. How would you define BDD, and what exactly is it according to you and according to your customers and the clients that you work with?
Yeah, so behavioral-driven development is an approach that is used to articulate with the customers and the tech team or engineers how a feature should interact with the user, right? So it's really a way to articulate the behaviors on a micro level, and how those behaviors for that feature is going to interact with the user and how is the system going to respond to the user based off of that interaction. So really getting into the details of at a very, very low level, but then also being able to combine those details so that you're seeing them from an epic level, a feature level, and your behavioral driven scenario level. So that's how I defined behavioral driven development.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. To go higher level, and as Melissa emphasized, you're putting the end user, you're putting the business first, and you're truly focused on what it is they need. One of the things that I find just so interesting, back in 1984, that's when I first got into development, got my degree out of college, got a job with Addison Wesley, and there was a development manager there who had a big poster in his office, and it said, and I thought this was interesting, he was a development manager, and he was interested in quality and testing, and the sign said, "Don't test what it does, test what it's supposed to do." So, in this day and age, here we are almost, oh my gosh, almost 40 years later. And boy, do I feel old. And I'm feeling like he was ahead of his time. So that's one of the things from a quality perspective I love about BDD is you're focused on testing what it's supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. And John, do you find the same in your sphere of work?
Very similar, right? A lot of what AccuSoft does is on the API side of things. But at the end of the day, we still have users who are using our APIs. And we still need to focus on ensuring we're solving whatever problem that user needs. And I've found the best way to explain that and ensure we're testing what it's supposed to do is using BDD as well.
Absolutely.
Can I also touch on one other thing too? Is I think that Bob, you brought up a good point. Is not like testing. Don't test what it's doing. Test what it should be doing. And one of the things is that behavioral driven development is not just for technology, right? It's just not for just software development. But if you think about the common things that we do on a regular basis, we sit in a chair, we sit at a desk. These are the behaviors in which we interact with these tools, because desks are tools in order for us to perform a job. So behavioral driven development is really based on the behavior of anything. Like, how are you going to interact with flowers or pillows or whatever, right? So, I'm kind of simplifying it to a certain extent, but it's really how are you interacting with the device or tool at hand?
Yeah, I think it ties really well into user experience, right? There's a lot of focus on UX these days, and BDD really helps you put requirements into a user experience mindset.
Absolutely. And I feel like it came at the right time as well. I mean, people had already started aligning themselves with agile workflows where we focus on user stories. It's more user-centric. And just to kind of upend the process a little, shake it around and say, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to figure out exactly what those behaviors are the people are doing, want to be doing, shouldn't be doing, everything associated with how the end user interacts with the application, and seeing how we can quantify that. So it came at a very good time in the industry. Once we kind of matured with some of these agile methodologies, it was there to solve a problem. I suppose we should touch on what BDD is not, having defined what it is, because this often comes up in my experience that there's a lot of kind of misconceptions about what BDD is and what it can do. So, Bob, do you want to take a stab at that?
One thing, and when I obviously, Dermot, when I answer a lot of these questions, I'm going to be focused on a quality and a testing point of view. So one of the things I would say that it is not, because I see this mistake a lot, it is not a focus on implementation. It's not a focus on how it's going to be done. A lot of times when I see some of the scenarios written, I see words such as, click far too often, or enter as though you're going to be entering a value in a field, or select from drop-down list, which is clearly all about implementation. So that's what it is not. It is not about implementation.
Mm-hmm.
It's also not a replacement for solid technical design. You still have to spend the time to build a backend that supports the user's interactions.
Absolutely, yeah. And Melissa, you were going to say
I was
something.
going to say, I think there's a good point here where it's not all of the technical details and how things are going to get done. But again, we go back to the behaviors, right? So it goes back to being able to align with the product, program or product or business team, and aligning with their information that they're providing.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I found when I was working with people who wanted to adopt BDD was that one common misconception was that we'll adopt a tool and then we're doing BDD, and it's so much more than that.
Well, that's just life. That's what CrowdStrike has, right? Like that's
exactly.
Everybody thinks there's a tool. There's a tool that's going to magically make it work.
Yeah, we're doing quality now.
Yeah.
We have a tool.
Yeah, but the other thing about that is it's the common language, right? So, Bob touched on if you're saying enter, select, and so forth. It's really the common language. If you can get to a real good framework and a common language, you really implemented BDD well, right? Like if you can get that framework and how you're going to basically dissect the project in a way where you have repeatable, reusable components of your different scenarios, then you're probably doing BDD pretty good.
Mm-hmm. And that's can be a tricky thing. I mean, obviously, fundamentally, what a lot of people following BDD-based workflows are using is Gherkin. So that's the whole given, when, then scenario-based description of a behavior that you want to implement and test for. But it goes beyond that, because then you have to have a domain-specific language, and the way you talk about things needs to be kind of unified. Has that been a challenge for the three of you when you've been working with on projects and working towards adoption of BDD?
For me, I've seen it, especially on teams that have a mix of native speakers and non-native speakers. English is incredibly not precise. So oftentimes you have to agree on definitions of words and what they mean in order to ensure communication is clear.
Absolutely. And even when talking about the product, Melissa, I imagine you kind of have to lock down what it is you're talking about when you're talking about something, because you could have one scenario referring to the go button and another scenario saying the button that does the thing. And if people are imprecise or at least not unified about the way that they address an interface or some process, is that something like that's something that I've encountered as a user, but as somebody driving change, is it something that you can maybe speak to, but also is it something that you've been able to overcome?
Yeah, I think we've overcome that, and that's because of our tool Swiftly. Just because we found the language that works, right?
Mm-hmm.
That has worked in that particular format that's automatically generated in order to keep it concise and to basically create a key domain language for everyone to talk from, right? And so it's not, of course, perfect. There's no such thing, but it does give you a sense of, oh, this is generally what we're talking about for this particular feature within the system. So I think for us, in terms of your original question and how have we managed the language, the difference in the way that user stories are created or on our projects is we've created the framework to make it consistent, right? And we found those patterns. So I think that's really key. Is I think a lot of times projects that start out with, oh, we're just going to write anything and make it generalized, when they move into the development, that impacts a lot of their development because they're not starting with the pseudocode or the user stories to have its own language, right? That's what software is. Software is good because it has its own unique language and syntax that you can follow. So if you have to start the BDD and your requirements the same way, same syntax, same things that you have to follow in order to make it very effective. If it doesn't start out that way, that's where the quality starts to go down.
Absolutely.
And I also believe it's important when coming up with the words and the phrases that you're going to use to have some sort of a project dictionary. So for example, something as simple as login credentials. Well, a year ago, that might have meant username and password. Now it might mean username, password, and then some sort of a third factor authentication ID. So, and you know, one of the great things from a testing perspective, if we all agree what user credentials mean, then whenever we see that, we can have a common routine automated off to the side that's providing the username, the password, and then generating some third factor authentication ID code, you know, to make it easier to have that framework and the reusable automated routines. But so, you know, a lot of the phrases and the words you're going to use in your organization, it's important to have a data dictionary and then standardization on some of the wording that you're going to use in the scenarios. Absolutely. It helps a lot. It makes it so much easier.
And by maintaining that as well, you can push the complexity down into whatever glue code, whatever scripting code you're going to use, because the plain language is the plain language and it's domain specific.
Exactly. It makes maintenance so much easier.
Yeah, that's actually a challenge. We have a slide, like a section on this webinar about challenges, and that's certainly something that people have articulated to me as a challenge, is maintenance. So we'll be covering that in a bit. I want to move us on to one of the key points that we called out in the agenda when we set up the webinar, which is integrating a BDD-based workflow into automated testing, pipeline-based testing, and automated build cycles and delivery cycles. So on the face of it, you look at something like Cucumber and you say, oh, I can kick off a set of Cucumber tests as part of a build step in my pipeline. And that seems simple, but it's not maybe taking into consideration the other aspects of BDD, the collaboration part, the discovery part that led into that. So maybe you could talk us through, you know, some of the issues that would be involved to take one or other side of that into consideration when you're building your pipeline or when you're building your communication and collaboration workflows between members of your team. John, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing comes to requirements, right? So if you've got your product team, your BAs, or whoever's writing the requirements, you familiar with the language that you're using, that immediately helps solve the agile user story problems, helps identify your tests, helps identify the product level. Because at the end of the day, BDD is really strong at high level testing of the product. It's not going to replace the unit tests, but having those solid requirements from day one as to what goes into your user story is really a strong benefit I've found.
Absolutely. Bob, how about you? I mean, speaking from the QA side of things, obviously the old-fashioned way would involve the QA side of things late on in the process, and then they're already fitting into maybe a program that's been predefined. But with BDD, everyone is talking from the get-go.
Yeah, and that's one of the top three things that I love about BDD is it pulls quality and testing up at the beginning. 20 years ago, I was on a project with the FBI and it was waterfall. One of the amazing things though, and you know, I learned a lot, was that on the quality assurance and software testing side, we had testers attend every type of peer review, every type of design session. So they were able to ask questions and be thinking, wow, how am I going to test that? So that's the great thing about BDD, is it starts that conversation so much earlier. And then one of the things that I've always felt is important, and it's very true with BDD, it's got to be a culture. It's got to be a culture of quality throughout the entire process. And everybody's got to embrace that. You've got to make sure to address any kind of resistance to change you may have within the organization. Those are the types of things that will definitely help, and don't over rely on the tools that you have.
Yeah, it comes down to people.
Yes,
people
absolutely.
drive this forward.
That's it, exactly.
It's always
Exactly.
the people.
Melissa, from your point of view, the getting the buy-in at each stage. So like you have discovery, the formulation, and you have the automation and the running of those tests within frameworks and pipelines. When you're approaching a BDD-based workflow, how do you manage feedback from those automated tests, and what does it drive? Does it drive further discussion, or is it just kind of monitoring purposes?
It's a loop, so it drives further discussion, like for backlog grooming or backlog refinement, right? So let's say if something comes out of the automated workflow or test cases, then that information now feeds back into your backlog and maybe modifies an existing user story in order to be pushed through the next sprint or the next release, or however you prioritize that. But I do think that a part of that, when it gets to, and I'm going to bring this up, which is risk, risk driven, right? So one of the main things when something comes out of automated testing is, what is the risk to it? Like, it could be something where, something is grayed out and it should be blue. I don't know, right? So that's not as risky unless you're dealing with a 508 compliance issue, right? So then that takes your risk up a little bit higher. But if it's not impacting something like accessibility or 508 compliance, it could be lower down in priority because it's not as risky, right? So then all of that information that comes from automated testing really impacts the requirements in the cycle, especially as we're doing it iteratively, as we're doing it through an agile process. So that's what at least we've experienced and what we've seen, especially through the pipeline using DevOps.
Mm-hmm. Because on the face of it, like an agile pipeline or an automated DevOps style pipeline will feedback passes or fails, but you need somebody to interpret that. And it goes back to what we mentioned earlier. It comes down to people and people talking.
Yes. Yep. Yes, AI is not going to really try to, take this over. It's going to be very difficult.
Like, there may be areas where AI can come in handy.
Yes.
And I think we discussed that a bit as well, but certainly you can't take away that input that humans have. I mean, yeah, I think you've all probably been in situations where a human wasn't involved, and CloudStrike,
yeah,
where some assessment was supposed to happen and it didn't happen, and had a human been there, they might have thought, hang on a second. And it might have had a different outcome. But yeah.
Yeah, the power of intuition, the gut feeling is overlooked. And that's something that we have, that you're right, Dermot. That's somebody might have scratched their head and said, something's not right here.
Exactly. And yeah, what I like about BDD is that leaves room for that intuitional step. It leaves space for people to say, oh, hang on. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're doing it, like, if you have a good foundation for BDD, right, it does leave that. But I've seen it implemented where they're just throwing Gherkin code at it, right? And they're like, oh, we're doing BDD. So it's really, and I think I want to stress this as much as possible, it's really developing that foundation and the framework around it, so that you can get to the points in which you're speaking about, where you're like, oh, let's ask more questions about this. And how does that fit into the bigger picture? What is the impact of this particular story on this particular story and so forth, and the traceability behind all of that. So
absolutely. And I suppose the characteristic of that is a good discovery practice, which
yes.
can be different from organization to organization. I mean, John, maybe you can tell us where you've seen it work in a kind of efficient way, where discovery is, what tools you use for discovery, maybe, or practices, or even just considerations.
So I was just going to jump in. I think one of the things maybe we haven't touched on, that where BDD really does provide value, is not for the person currently working on the software, but the person who's going to be working on it next, right? As a software engineer, we often talk about, you're right, you leave comments in code not for yourself, but for your future self.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is a story of, this is what the product is supposed to do, and if it's no longer doing that, was that an intentional change or was it an unintentional change? Yeah, you can do that with unit tests and other types of testing, but the fact that it's written in English or whatever language you happen to use makes it very easy for someone who's relatively new to the product to understand what the behavior is supposed to be.
Absolutely. Melissa, when you do discovery, or when you go through that discovery step and that collaborative step, do you follow any formal practice, or is it a set of meetings that have like a workflow? Or
it's a little bit of both. So we predict it, right? So we predict, depending on the industry, the organizational's process, we predict what their process will be. We do a whole bunch of research, right? So we don't have our clients sit in a bunch of meetings and ask them blanket questions. We do that research. We put that research through our tool, and we predict all of the user stories and epics and features and a bunch of requirements for them. And then we have them validated, right? And all of this is we do this based off of behavior-driven approach. So whatever is created is going to be created using a behavioral-driven focus. And then we're able to basically sit in, maybe, depending on the size of the project, like let's say if the project is impacting 10,000 users, not 50,000 users, but 10,000 users. If it's impacting 10,000 users, we're able to have a 2-3 hour conversation for a release planning session, go through those epics and features and user stories, prioritize them, and say this is going to be their first iteration. And then having 2-3 hour sessions maybe subsequently for all the other releases, and then churning through those sprints with the developers and the testers and so forth, and going through that pipeline. Now, if it's a project that's more than 10,000 people, that's impacting 10,000 customers, like if it's going to impact 50,000 customers or so, that's going to be a little bit more detailed, because you have to have a lot more eyes on that in terms of where those requirements are going to be impacting, concurrent users, performance, and so forth, for a lot more a user base and quality around that. So in order to reduce a lot of the talking that we did before in waterfall and like early agile, we've been able to reduce that time frame pretty significantly with identifying what are our talking pieces up front, and then elaborating on those talking pieces from there.
And Dermot, if I can jump here,
sure.
Two philosophies, if you will, I'll call it, or strategies that I try to use on discovery is, a college professor of mine said many years ago, don't give the customer what they want, give them what they need. I truly feel it's our job to help them figure out what it is they need. So in that regard, I use an engineering approach called the 5 whys, and that's not the letter Y, W-H-Y. So I will ask, well, why is that? And I will ask that oftentimes more than 5, because eventually you will get to the truth, and you will get to what is needed, which is determined, all right, yeah, what we want is what we need. The other thing, and Melissa alluded to this previously, was I love risk analysis. So when doing discovery, I try to understand, all right, if that feature, if that function, if that process should fail, what's the impact to the business and what's the likelihood that it will fail? And that helps prioritize a lot of the different follow-on tasks. So those are two things that I try to use: risk analysis and the 5 whys. Those help quite a bit.
Absolutely. And risk analysis helps you to kind of sift out the hard whys and the soft whys. Why? Because we kind of want it. Why? Because we'll be fined if we don't deliver.
Exactly. It helps us figure out, okay, what are we going to do first? What are we going to save for labor later, as well as the best team that I'm going to allocate to the task.
Exactly.
There's a serious issue. Hey, John Armini is going to be on that because of his expertise and seniority.
Absolutely. So I suppose that brings us on to the next section. So we've mentioned a few potential challenges along the way. We've just spoken about Melissa, you were talking about shortening the amount of time taken to have the necessary conversations. There's certainly something that I've experienced when I've dealt with teams who are adopting BDD was when they tried to do it, they were spending an inordinate amount of time talking about stuff, and they found that they didn't have enough time to actually implement and test. So that sort of synthesis that you spoke to is certainly a challenge, and knowing where and what you have to discuss. So you had a predictive model. Are there other ways that you can approach this in order to kind of break it down or try and synthesize the talking points down into the shortest possible time?
Yeah, so let's say if you have a customer that comes to you and they want to implement a veterinarian intake system. I'm just throwing that off the top of my head. And so part of that intake is, maybe registration, and then you have processing the intake form, and then intake, basically the medical process, right? So I'm just going to use those 3 different buckets. Off the top of my head, those are my 3 epics.
Okay.
Right. So the whole point is to look at your process, the customer that you're working with, their business process, identifying what the top high level epics are off just doing research. And then those are your epics from a behavioral driven standpoint. I used, register, right? So registering is the first thing, registering the user or registering the customer, actually processing the intake form. That's another, right, epic. And then doing the actual intake. So going through the process of seeking medical attention for whatever pet you have. And so, and then even in that, in seeking medical attention, that's its own project probably in and of itself, or, its own process. So there may be other epics from there. But the intent is that you look at the users, look at their business process, you take those big chunks of what's going to be impacted by those users. And then now when you have those big chunks, so your epics, you go into the features. You identify what those features are. Now we use what we have is a CAVES-D approach. So it's an expansion of CRUD. So CRUD was create, read, update, delete, but CRUD was developed when there was DB2, right? So we have a lot of expansion from DB2. So now we have CAVES-D, which is create, audit, view, edit, search, and delete. And so the whole point with that is being able to now look at the epics, identify from there the additional CAVES-D components of that, and then breaking those down to its own user stories. That's pretty much what our model does, right? It's not that's exactly how we do everything. Is we look at and it's worked consistently on every project. Here's the process. Here are the 5 to 8 main areas of that process from a program or business perspective. And then taking that one area, using CAVES-D to break it down. And even if they don't need to create something, let's say from CAVES-D, we have another model that we can use, that may be importing, or what John's working on, APIs. There's another model that we have for API connections and all these other models. So if it's not just creating information, then it could be a connection and integration. And then along with that, there's your standard, because I just talked about from your product or your business perspective. But then when you get into your because every project should have some type of IT product manager, right? Or some technical product manager. So if you talk about your product management from the technical perspective, you're going to be talking about integrations. You're going to be talking about reporting, maybe. You're going to talk about database architecture, infrastructure. All of these are going to be their own epics as well that are going to be parallel with your product epics or your business owner epics as well. And so then you're able to lay out from your business perspective to your technical perspective on what that roadmap would look like and how your technical infrastructure will align with your business roadmap going throughout the implementation of the system. So, and I just did that particularly without a tool. It's just having a conversation. And of course, being in the industry for so long.
Yeah.
Right?
Heuristics that will build up over years.
Correct.
Yeah,
right.
yeah, absolutely.
Bob, from your point of view, do you find that kind of synthesis of talk a challenge, or have you encountered other common mistakes that you've seen made when people are implementing BDD?
So
challenges to adoption.
So the biggest challenge that I've seen is the resistance to change by the team. Again, it goes back to the vast majority of challenges that I see are relative to the people. And the other thing that I see is that I don't know what the word new means anymore because things are changing so rapidly. Mm-hmm. But really, BDD, if I'm not mistaken, was first developed, I think, by Dan North back in around 2006. So it's still relatively new. And so people are still used to writing test cases based on the implementation. Mm-hmm. And that's why they have such a challenge with scenarios. Yeah. The other thing that I see is that people just become too tool dependent. I've always, you can give the worst carpenter in the world the best hammer in the world, and they are still the worst carpenter in the world. It's not going to change anything. So those are some of the big challenges. And then the other thing, people are so focused on effectiveness that they don't think about efficiency. Mm-hmm. And the vast majority of organizations and people, they know how to test. So they're effective at it. They're just not efficient. And it is a business. The business is supposed to make or save money. It's supposed to provide value. So efficiency is critical when it comes to testing and quality assurance. So those are some of the things that I think people forget or tend to do.
Absolutely.
Yeah, an example we ran into to kind of pick up where Bob left off was with the efficiency aspect. When we initially first implemented BDD, we used Gherkin. And what we noticed was there was like a one-to-one test case between what we wrote in Gherkin and the code that was executed. So we weren't getting the reuse from the higher level scenarios. So we had to stop once we saw what was going on and figure out where we had gone wrong and start effectively from scratch. So that's an easy pitfall an easy pit to fall into.
Absolutely. From my personal experience, what I learned about BDD and using Gherkin, I always say I learned a lot from doing it very badly. So when I started out, I was writing procedural scenarios, like click this button and then click that button and then enter that text. And looking back at it now,
where we were.
Exactly. But yeah, when you start to see that you've got that sort of rationalization step between the plain language and using the code for code and things that coding is good at and scripting is good at, you start to see the potential efficiency there. Okay, I'm aware of the time. We're coming up on the Q2 mark, so I want to get on to the last section here, which is the future of BDD. The future of BDD. What can you tell us by predicting the future and putting on your prognostication hats there and telling us what you see becoming more of a thing in BDD in the near term or in the far term.
Obviously, AI. There's going to be opportunities for AI to help expand on scenarios, build data tables and things like that. That one seems like the most obvious. I'm sure there's more that I'm not even thinking about right now.
Yep, Melissa.
I agree 100% with that.
Sure.
It's I think everybody is starting to use generative AI more and more. I think the part of AI that we're going to see in the near future is once we figure out how to test decision-making AI better, we're going to see decision-making AI used more often in our development and testing processes.
Mm-hmm. Melissa, how about you?
Yes, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, our Swiftly tool is already using engine AI-based solution, right, to predict all of these scenarios. But then also, I think that we're going to be in an environment that I agree with John and Bob, where we're going to be able to utilize more scenarios that will be able to build off of each other and create the data elements and so forth. But then also we'll be able to create scenarios based off of reading user interfaces, right? So being able to really start to change the way that user stories are created pretty close to manually right now, right? Depending on what solutions that you're using. And then being able to automate those by reading the interfaces, but then you still need a quality check behind that. So I think generative AI is going to be useful when doing some parts of this. And then other forms of AI, like when you get into quantum computing, like if we get a lot of the data, historical data from projects into a quantum computing system, being able to read and generate additional information from the data that is stored there, that would be awesome, but I don't think we have enough processing around it yet. So, but that would be a future thing, of course.
Yeah, definitely. One area that occurs to me is that one of the hard nuts to crack that people who are adopting BDD often found was figuring out the common steps or the common objects with which they want to interface with their Gherkin code. So just binding that to something meaningful is sometimes a kind of an abstraction that they're not used to doing, or they're not sure how to do that mapping. And where I see AI, generative AI coming in, is maybe breaking down that difficulty barrier a little bit by being able to suggest routines, or Melissa, you mentioned being able to understand interfaces, not just copy, not just replicate, but actually understand the way an interface works. So in theory, you could pass a wireframe to a generative AI interface and have it pick out the parts that you're going to interact with and maybe build descriptors and prototypes that would allow you to interface with that. And then cobbling that together would be relatively straightforward, as opposed to building them from scratch. And then from the wireframe, mapping it over to the actual built interface as it gets built would be relatively straightforward. But yeah, I feel like it has a place. We mentioned earlier, it's not going to replace the human aspect. It's not going to replace that intuition. But I see where I see it has the most benefit is the potential for being an assistive technology and just reducing overhead, and not reducing people. It's very important.
And let's concentrate on that a little bit, not reducing people, because then we can solve newer problems, right? Like once we solve one solution and we built this software, now we can be effective on another software, another, emerging technology, right? Because it's not just software that's going to be in the future, but we're talking about AR, VR environments. We're talking about autonomous computing and automated, cars and so forth. So when we start talking about trying to solve for this particular solution, I think a lot of people are kind of just stuck in, this is going to take away my job because AI is going to make me more efficient and faster. But what it's going to also do is empower us to solve newer, more complex problems, right? Like that's where we need to go. I feel like we're even as for us, I feel like we're way behind on different problems we could solve.
Absolutely.
Because we're trying to solve all these things that could have been solved before. Right?
Exactly.
20 years ago, when I was doing a lot of training and speaking, and I still do a lot of speaking on test automation, and this was 20 years ago, but that was a big question I would get, Dermot, was, all right, is test automation going to, allow us to reduce our team size from 20 people down to 10 people? And I came up with this, I called it, the deeper moat approach, that if a king has shovels and he's got to have his, kingdom dig a moat, and now he gets a steam shovel, he's not going to dig the same size moat. He's going to dig a deeper, wider moat. So like Melissa just said, that with a lot of the technology that's happening now, we're going to be able to do more, and we will do more. It might require people to be retrained, but that's okay. But it will allow us to tackle bigger problems.
Absolutely. John, have you seen that kind of weird dichotomy where people say, oh, we're going to adopt automation or AI, and it means I don't have to hire as many people?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's generally where it first starts. But in fact, when we first rolled out AI assisting tools to our engineers, they were all like, oh, they just think they're going to get rid of us. No, what we're trying to do is let you not waste the time that doing the things that AI can do for you, and let you focus on the times where the human brain can actually is more productive, right? Thinking about the hard problems, using intuition like we talked about, approaching things from the what do you really mean when you say this, as opposed to the literal sense that AI is going to take.
Exactly. And as good as it is, it's always going to opt for literal. Sometimes with hilarious consequences. I don't know if you've had some ChatGPT interactions. My most recent interaction with ChatGPT was about Wordle, and it consistently kept recommending a word that didn't fit, and he said, "Oh, sorry, I meant this word that I already recommended." It's just not quite there. It does not have the scope to replace a human, certainly in Wordle context, but also in an agile team, replacing that spark of intuition, that just level of understanding of humans and the way we behave and the way we interact with systems.
But I think to get to that point, because we'll get there, but to get to that level of intellect and detail, we need to pre-train, right? We need to pre-train on the data for projects. So I think eventually we will have pre-trained models for various projects, for various organizations, for various industries. They'll have their own pre-trained models that are going to be able to generate and have the accuracy and lower the hallucinations because they've been pre-trained on that particular domain.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think domain-specific AI is much closer and much more helpful than the generic AI that seems to be what everybody's aiming for. I mean, anecdotally, I had an AI engine promise me that it tested my code that it generated for me, and it didn't work, right? So at least I got the engineer part of it down, right? I promise you I tested it.
Well, I think currently wherever there is artificial intelligence, I think wherever there's artificial intelligence, we also have artificial stupidity also.
Yes.
Could potentially exist. So
that's built into the system.
Artificial areas of improvement.
There you go. Yeah, much better way to put it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. So with areas of improvement uppermost in our mind, I think we can probably wrap this up. If there's
what happened
something...
to the poll? What happened to the poll?
Oh, the poll. I'm going to share the results now. So yeah, we had Noah and Partially were the winners when it comes to people implementing BDD.
Wow.
We had a few people answering as to just curious as to what BDD was. Behavior-driven development. I think we mentioned it a few times. Just want to put it out there just in case. And we had one respondent who intends to. So it's an interesting spread if I were looking at a poll like this across like a demographic that we have here, maybe 2 years ago, it would have been very much knows and intends to, rather than it wouldn't have been so much partially and yes. So, I mean, that's just from the audience that I'm used to seeing. How about you folks? Do you see progress? Do you see change or variance in the BDD landscape in the last 2 to 3 years?
I think
I'm
some
seeing
people
progress. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Melissa.
I was really quickly. I was going to say I think some organizations have implemented it. They probably just don't know it because they're looking at, oh, we're not doing it because we don't have Gherkin code in, right? And so they could be they probably want to look at an assessment just to see, and at least it could be a partial or whatever. But I think more people are doing it more than they think they are.
Good point. Bob, you were going to say?
I would have to say I'm probably seeing slightly slower growth or expansion into BDD than I would have expected a year ago. Right. I would have thought the poll, would have shown a greater number of organizations either are using BDD or intend to.
Okay. And John, from your experience, does this track with what you've seen, or?
It does. I feel like the shift from traditional or other types of testing to BDD is kind of a heavy lift, and it's a difficult sell at a company. It can be difficult, especially for an established product. Maybe on newer products, some of these more modern techniques can be applied. But when you talk about shifting to BDD from traditional automated testing for a 15-year-old product, that's a pretty heavy lift, and it generally seems to be most engineering management teams aren't willing to take that on.
I know Matt Wynn and Seb Rose used to always emphasize that if you're adopting BDD or converting to BDD in an existing project, start small and start slow, which is fine, and it certainly gets you there. But the drawback, I suppose, is that you're starting small and you're starting slow. Yep. So that necessarily impacts the rollout or the adoption. So I suppose that probably tracks with the poll. But I suppose the thing we should end on really is that there are mitigation steps that you can take to manage the adoption of BDD, to watch out for pitfalls, and there's maybe even technology coming that might make it a bit easier. So on that note, I'm going to wind it up, folks. Thank you so much for joining me, Melissa, John, and Bob. And thanks to all our attendees for coming and listening. We hope to see you all very soon. And until the next webinar, have a great morning, afternoon, or evening.